All right, so let's take a look at this. This is something and Hannah, I'm still searching for that testimony, but I do believe there was testimony of I do recall of Chris as well doing this, but this is some pretty telling stuff. Now that we know this fire is less than 24 hours before this moment, we know, and this tells you what the direction they were moving and how concerned they were based on the statement Scott was making at the scene. So let's go play this here. Give me one moment.
Human remains on appear to be human remains on a fire, burned to a degree at which none of us had ever seen before in many years of law enforcement experience. We knew that people were already talking away from family members and providing information that had us very concerned. And when we respond to any death investigation, we look at it as a potential homicide from the onset of the case until we find evidence to support that it is not a homicide.
And so that evidence would have been Scott Farris telling multiple people that a gun was missing, yes?
That is not the only information that we had, no.
What other information?
The degree to which the body was burned. I've been taught in previous homicide classes that bodies caught up in brush fires or caught up on fires are oftentimes not burned up to that degree, and that should be a very concerning thing if you were to see it when you initially respond to somebody that has fallen on a fire. So I have been taught that in homicide schools, that if somebody is in like a brush fire or like even like a little burn pile, but they are like almost gone and all you have is some bones, that is a very concerning thing, and you should take note of that and start looking deeper as soon as you see something along those lines. So that, in conjunction with family members already starting to talk about other family members in terms of everything from potential drug problems to missing guns to also notably potentially blood in the house, all of these things and combined led us to be concerned that this was potentially more than an accidental death or a natural death from pretty much the onset of law enforcement's arrival. Most of that information was gained by even uniformed patrol before Detective Hayes and I made it on scene.
Right, because Scott Farris was telling multiple people that a gun was missing in the house.
That is one of the factors, but again, not the only factor.
Did you already know that he was telling people that before he got in your car for your interview with Scott Farris?
Yes, sir. I had heard that when he was alone with one of the officers on scene, he had started reporting that there was a firearm missing. He had also said that there was he believed it was blood in the house, which again, those facts combined with how severe the body was burned and how there was almost nothing left of a very large man led us to immediately have concerns that this death was potentially something that wasn't an accidental death or a natural death. So we investigate every case like a homicide from the onset until we have evidence to prove otherwise, and we didn't have any evidence to prove otherwise.
Okay, tell me about your interview with Scott Farris.
It was done in my car, away from everyone else, so nobody else could hear it. It was audio recorded.
Okay, what did he tell you?
We talked for an hour and a half about everything from the family dynamics.
What time of day was that, by the way? Was the sun still up?
It was around 2 p.m.
So within the first hour.
All right, so that was the clip. So now we're going to play. I found the testimony of the business associate who said that Chris knew the caliber of gun when he shouldn't have, and he was concerned about it. Now, Hannah B., to answer your question, you said if the fire was tended to, how would she know when it was started? Okay, first of all, her testimony was that it wasn't tended to, in terms of it wasn't stirred or anything of that nature, that this was a one burn fire. And what she said was the way she knew the temperature was because they took a temperature at the time of when they discovered it. And based on the fact it was 200 degrees and the fact that the coals were still warm, the body was still warm. And I think the body had a temperature of like 130 degrees or something like that. Based on that determination and those calculations, she was able to walk this back because she said otherwise, if it was colder, she would have thought that it could have been a longer term. But she said based on those calculations, this was laid back 24 hours at maximum. Okay. Now, I want you to pick up on what you just heard there. Scott is telling them not just about a gun. He's telling them about blood in the house. Now, remember, by Scott's own admission on the witness stand, he's not in that house. He's out at the lake house. The only time he said he went in that house was he said he went to the front door and then he walked in to go to Melody's and go upstairs. The only time he's in that house, we're to believe that he's discovering these minute drops of blood, okay, in the moments after he discovers his dad in the burn pile. No one else has noticed it. The granddaughters haven't noticed it, okay? No one else is noticing blood in the house, but he knows where every blood drop is. He knows there's this bullet in the house, okay? And that's what he's telling police. He was trying to implicate his mother in this. And again, it worked because the investigators immediately began focusing on that house. Now, the problem is the amount of blood that was found, and when they luminol the place, there's no indication a shooting took place. And there was 4 drops of Gary's blood, very small, the size of like a needlehead, which would be indicative of the fact that she testified, or as others testified, that he had a dog bite that caused him to bleed a lot, or be bleeding, and that it's very likely that's what the cause was. I mean, Melody Farris's blood was found there. There's no indication if she's shooting him or hurting him, or that there was any cuts on Melody Farris's body. So, I'm sure if you went around anybody's house, it's very possible there could be blood drops found for a multitude of reasons. It could be a cut shaving. It could be a bloody nose, etc. And all of those things are not uncommon when you're living in a place. Now, what would be uncommon is a large amount. Blood splatters that would indicate, listen, if he's shot, there's going to be a splattering of blood, just like you have the blood splatter analyst. Where was that? If he's shot in the house, it's splattering. There's no getting around that. And there was no indication near where that bullet was found that it would have been. Now, one thing I picked up on the anthropologist's testimony, Scott, or the anthropologist or the defense attorney, was saying, look, there was a piece of rib found here and there was a piece of rib found here. Could it have been that Scott went to the burn pile and the reason why those ribs were scattered was because he picked it up and got the bullet that ended up being found inside the house out of that? That maybe there were 2 bullets found in the ribs, and that's why he picked that up and dropped that, and it ends up away from the pieces of the body where it was at. Could that have been an indicator that someone was picking a bullet up out of there and taking it inside, believing then that the police would find that bullet, and believe the shooting ended up happening in there, or happening inside the house? So what we're about to watch here is where this is a business associate who says one of his sole purposes of testifying is to talk about, I think, financial matters, and then he talks about the fact that Scott had called and told him about it being a .38 caliber bullet before, and he says the police officers told him when he's talking to the police that they didn't even know what caliber it was, but that not Scott, but that Chris was telling him this, which could indicate, again, and where my head was at this time, was that both were there. Both were in on this. But let's check this out.
And if anything like that happens, immediately remove yourself from the situation. Let us know about it. We'll take it up.
Patrick Joseph Clark.
Where is it that you work, Mr. Clark?
I work at Burn Foreman.
What, I guess, branch? Which practice of Burn Foreman?
I work in our Mobile, Alabama office, but I was in our Atlanta office for about 22 years. 22 years?
Yeah. And do you know Gary Farris?
I do.
How do you know Gary Farris?
Gary and I we first met, back before I became a Burn Foreman attorney. We were actually on the opposite side of real estate transactions and just got to know each other over the years. And at a certain point in time, Gary had talked to me about coming to work with Burn Foreman, and at a certain point in time, I did that. So we practiced together, up until his death.
Can you describe your relationship with Mr. Farris?
Yeah, Gary was a good friend of mine, and you know, while we didn't spend a lot of time together outside the office, and there's various reasons for that, you know, we each had our own lives, and, you know, people who live in the Atlanta area and everything, you know how it is, commute-wise, and, you know, we worked so much that whatever free time that we had, weekends, et cetera, we generally were spending with our families, et cetera. But, you know, we would get together, play golf sometimes, go out and shoot ski, and go, you know, I think we went on a couple of dove hunts together. But, you know, most of our time was spent as friends in the office, going to lunch when it was appropriate. We'd go out to dinner with clients sometimes, and et cetera. But, you know, I considered Gary to be a very good friend of mine.
Did you ever hang out with Gary's family?
Some, yes.
How well did you know the rest of the family?
You know, I knew who all they were. I mean, I knew all their names. I knew Melody. I knew, you know, Chris and Scott and Amanda and Emily. Went to Chris's wedding. Went to Emily's wedding. You know, Gary would tell me what was going on with his kids sometimes, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I knew the family.
Can you explain to the jury Gary's work ethic, or how often you guys have to work in your line of work?
Yeah, we work a lot. We are commercial real estate transactional lawyers, and we don't do any residential real estate work. It's all commercial real estate. And our practice primarily was representing institutional type lenders in commercial real estate transactions, construction loans, permanent loans, various different kinds of properties, multifamily apartment complexes, industrial buildings, office towers. We oftentimes did what we call syndicated transactions, which involve multiple banks, you know, high dollar, high volume transactions involving what you would consider to be very sophisticated real estate developers, very sophisticated lenders, and it required a lot of time and effort to get those deals done. A lot of time and effort to get those deals done.
Would you work holidays frequently?
Yes, definitely. You know, our clients were very demanding, justifiably so, and you know, our work ethic and was always, you know, we did and took the time that was needed to accomplish what it was that they were engaging us to do. And our practice, so a little bit better to understand that, is our practice was nationwide in scope. We closed deals all across the United States. And again, you know, we were dealing with financial institutions in New York and Boston and California and other places. So oftentimes there would be time frames where you'd be doing a transaction out in California, and they'd be 2 or 3 hours behind us, depending on what time of the year it was. So it wasn't unusual for us to get on the phone with the client 10 o'clock our time, 6, 7 o'clock their time.
To your knowledge, did Gary Farris have any professional enemies?
No. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to try to explain that, because we're not criminal defense lawyers, we're not plaintiff's attorneys, we don't go into the courtroom. I've been in the courtroom one time in my entire career. And I think Gary probably was in the courtroom a little bit more, but he used to practice some bankruptcy law, so he was probably in there in that regard. But no, our work, our transactions always involved people on every aspect of the transaction who were trying to accomplish the same goal, which was to get a deal done.
Would Gary share with you information about his family and what was going on during certain times in his life?
Not really.
Was he kind of a private person?
Very.
Was he proud of his kids?
Yeah, to the extent that we talked about them.
What about Scott?
Yeah, I remember kind of the first time I ever met Scott. I guess he was younger, maybe in his teens. And I think the first time I ever met him, I had lunch with him and Gary. And he struck me as a young kid. And then I guess he kind of had different jobs. I think I remember that he was selling cars at one time. I think he worked as an auto mechanic, if I'm not mistaken. And then at a certain point in time, he decided to go into the military. And I remember how proud Gary was of that. Very much so.
Were you someone that the family reached out to when his remains were found on July 5th?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to speak with Melody that day?
No.
When did you speak with Melody about what happened on July 5th?
My recollection is I talked to Melody not too long after that, and I couldn't tell you exactly what I mean in terms of time by not too long after that. For obvious reason being it's 6 years ago.
Sure.
But I do remember that I did talk to Melody. I can remember I was sitting in my office in Mobile, and my phone rang, and I looked down, and it said Melody Farris, and I was a little bit surprised, but she called me in my office.
And what was it that she was calling you about?
She called me and asked me if I could provide any assistance or information about helping her, I guess, obtain or get access to Gary's capital contribution in our law firm.
What is a capital contribution?
Well, a capital contribution, so in law firms, you have different levels of people who work in a law firm. And our firm is a pretty large firm. We've got 19 different offices, but there's different organizational structures, organizational funds. But the way that our firm works is you have two levels of partners. You have what's referred to as equity partners, and then you have what's referred to as income partners, and then you have associates, right? So the hierarchy is, in terms of the firm structure itself, the equity partners are the owners of the law firm. So it's as if you owned a construction company and you're the owner. Income partners and associates are basically employees of the law firm. So they're W-2 employees. So our law firm, if there's profits at the end of the year, the equity partners share in the profits. So a capital contribution is the amount of money that, as the owner or equity partner in the law firm, that you're required to put in on an annual basis, et cetera, to maintain a certain level of capital for expansion, for needs to meet, upgrades in computer systems and so on and so forth. So it's basically a slug of money that's put in by the owners that's there and available for certain things.
And at any time, do you receive that contribution back throughout the year?
The only time that you receive it back is when you're no longer an equity partner.
Okay. Was Gary?
But you do have to put it in. The opposite's not true. You got to put it in every year.
Right.
So.
Was Gary a partner?
Yeah, Gary was an equity partner.
And did you continue to chat with Melody on the phone after she asked about that?
I did for a short period of time, yes.
What was it that you and her spoke about? After I had talked with Melody, or as she asked me about the capital contributions and assisting and trying to get it, and I
indicated to her that I would do what I could. I really didn't have any knowledge about that because I'd never been involved in having to get a capital contribution back. But I took the opportunity to ask Melody, what do they think happened? And she answered me.
What did she say?
She didn't really respond, in my opinion, to my question. She basically relayed to me, I guess if I think back on it now, what was going on the morning of the 4th of July. And what she told me was that she got up early in the morning or sometime in the morning, and she was blowing off, I guess, the leaves on either the driveway or somewhere around the house with a blower. And she finished that up. And then I remember her distinctly saying, and I know that Gary was there because I could smell cigarette smoke, right? And then she got prepared because she was going up to, I guess, Lake Lanier to spend the day with one of her children, and my recollection is it was her daughter Amanda. And she headed up to the lake.
And did she mention anything about if she went anywhere else before the lake?
Yeah, and I remember this conversation pretty vividly because it just struck me as unusual. She said, and on the way to the lake, I stopped at, my recollection was Target, and I bought a chair. And then she said something that really and she said, and I've got the receipt for that. And I went up to the lake, stayed up at the lake, came back home. She had 2 girls with her. I think one of them was her granddaughter and one of them was a friend of her granddaughter's. Got back home, went straight to the bedroom and stayed in there the rest of the night because they were tired and they were watching movies. And that was basically the extent of the conversation.
Did you ask her what she did that day, or was this unprompted?
It was unprompted. I didn't ask her what she did that day.
Mr. Clark, that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Clark. My name is John Luke Weaver, and I represent Melody.
All right, so it's on cross-examination that the gun stuff is going to come out. So basically, if you're listening to this whole thing here and you start to formulate saying, all right, the only thing that says Gary died on the 3rd and wasn't alive on the 4th when his phone is walking around the property, right, until what, about 1 o'clock, right, and the phone goes back inside, which is about the time the fire starts, okay. Again, and this is just evolving as you know, everyone knows what my theory has been up until now when we're trying to pocket all of this in based on this forensic anthropologist testimony. Just standing here and envisioning and saying, well, maybe she was up late on the 3rd because her granddaughter came into town. Remember, it was unusual, or her granddaughter came into town. And it was insinuated that she was told, don't let her come over tonight because she's grounded. I don't want her going up to the property yet. She tells her granddaughter, and that was what was, and that insinuation comes from if you listen to the question asked on cross-examination, which I'm saying would mean that had to come from a conversation that defense attorney had with Melody. So if we go there, right, and now we say it didn't even happen the 3rd. So Scott goes to golf. He gets the debit card from Melody, which is something that was common going on between them because both of them had problems getting money from Big Daddy. Scott goes golfing. Melody goes to Lake Lanier. Scott comes back home because he's just been golfing and he's got the PGA thing scheduled the next day and he's mad and he goes. And if this is the dispute over money, if this is the dispute because Scott wants this money to go buy these golf clubs, which some people have said is ridiculous, such as ridiculous as the idea that Melody killed him over money. if this death is happening, it's happening over money, over a dispute. And Gary's starting this burn pile, okay, at that time, or someone's starting a burn pile at that time. Boom. It happens. Now, I know everyone's going to say there was a gunshot heard between 9 and 10. Well, there was, but there was no fire between 9 and 10. There was no fire, according to our forensic anthropologist, that started until 1 p.m. the next day. So Melody couldn't have started that fire. There was no fire started that had a body on it on the 3rd or the 4th or the morning of the 4th. How do we know that? Because of what you just heard earlier. And if you're just joining us because you came in, you were dumped in here from my other live, go check it out, rewind it back, or wait for the premiere that's coming up in a little bit. And go check it out. Because that is where we're at here. But where we're at is we don't know. But where we're at is Rusty's statement, which is the only evidence that many, many people have laid their hat on. Why did she say that to Rusty? If the burn pile wasn't burning, if there wasn't any burn pile burning that night, then Rusty's statement is exactly what Rusty said it was. It was a false statement that he came up with under duress, believing he was about to be charged. It's very possible that she was involved at some level. It's very possible that she found out at some level. But it's also possible that there's a set of circumstances, and that is all the jury needs, is that doubt. What we're talking about right here is then you say there's doubt on the false statements, there's doubt on the concealing a body, because as we just walked through it, and you heard the testimony from Scott, or from that investigator who said Scott was acting very suspiciously. He knew about blood in the house. He knew about the bullet in the house. You talk about the forensic anthropologist who says, yeah, there was a bone that there was ribs over here. And they said, no, it couldn't have been from scattering or tending to the fire. That had to either be possibly an animal, or could it have been Scott or somebody lifting up that piece and getting the bullet out that was found inside. A bullet that had DNA, flesh DNA on it, still on it, and that was found inside that house. Is it possible? It's possible. Now, the only thing that I would say, and again, I don't know what testing they did on that bullet. Was there soot found on it? Was there anything that would indicate it was in a fire? That would potentially have maybe stood out to somebody if they were looking at it. But this is where we're at right now, and we're just looking back at a few witnesses here. I hope the jury in that jury room is remembering some of these things. Because if they are, the only verdict that should be returned is not guilty. Now, I still think that you're going to have people in that jury room. And again, maybe what we were hearing is maybe they remembered a forensic anthropologist. And maybe what they're getting to now is, okay, he said he was on the burn pile, not burning. It was on the burn pile could mean she had killed him and put him on the burn pile and then burn it later. And maybe they're going to say she snuck down there and ignited it, and the granddaughters didn't know and nobody knew. We know that the neighbors said that burn pile was burning on the 4th. We know that. We know the forensic anthropologist puts this burn pile burning on the 4th. Starting around 1 o'clock on the 4th. We know without a doubt Melody wasn't there. We know that Scott has no one to account for his whereabouts at that time. Because by the testimony of his best friend, and I guess I need to play that, the best friend says, we went back up there, and then I left, and then I didn't return till later in the afternoon. So I hope the jury is talking about all of these points, because it truly brings us to only one verdict, unless you're going to compromise back there, and that's not guilty. That's where this has to go. And anything less than not guilty is you got to take all the noise out. You got to take all the noise and the affairs and the bad behavior and the potential poisoning, and you take all of that out and you just look at the evidence of that day and what was possible to happen in that day. And Tina Reinhardt says, Melody has lied about everything. She said she wasn't having an affair, didn't have 2 phones. Why didn't she just get a divorce? Your children love their father. Well, again, part of that is because, as you've heard, and as you heard from Amanda Farris, look, sometimes people don't want a divorce for a multitude of reasons. She clearly could have divorced him back in 13, but she came back. As she told investigators, she had everything she ever wanted. I think she didn't want to divorce him because, again, a divorce complicates everything, just like killing him does. And what does it complicate? It means she's not going to have the ability to have the cash flow in her life to live the life she wants. So she needs him to be alive, and she needs him to be making money so she can keep living the life she wants to live. And divorcing him means she's going to have a finite amount of money. She's certainly not going to be able to maintain that farm or keep that place. Well, that's exactly correct, Marjorie Smith. It's emotional manipulation and that's what this whole case has been, is about vilifying. It's about vilifying Melody to the point that this jury doesn't worry about evidence. They just look past all these problems. So, all right, let's continue on, because we're going to get to the point now on cross-examination, I believe, where the information about Chris that I wanted to play comes out. And then in the meantime, I'm going to pull up the best friend's testimony so we can talk about Scott's.
Few quick questions. Based on what you just said, did you not call law enforcement in this case? Do you remember that?
I spoke to law enforcement.
Like, you called them. You had something. Yes, sir.
I spoke to law enforcement. I think it was the week after the 5th. I called and spoke with a detective who was the lead detective on the case. And I told him who I was. I told him what I did. And I told him that he and Gary and I did the same kind of work.
Sure.
And the reason I did that is because when most people think about lawyers, they think about people who spend time in the courtroom and people who spend time involved in litigation, etc. And I called him because I had become aware that the incident after finding Gary had become a homicide investigation. And I wanted to tell the detective, look, what you have to do, and I told him, I said, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but you need to know what it is we do. And we spend all of our time on the telephone, and we spend all of our time sending emails. So what you need to do is you need to look at our firm's email system and find out when the last time that Gary sent an email was, and if there's nothing after that, that's where you need to start. And that's what I told him. So that's when I contacted law enforcement. I never said anything to law enforcement about the conversation that I subsequently had with Melody until I was interviewed a month or so ago.
Do you remember when you called Detective Hayes also that there was something, you had a conversation with Chris, that there were some things that concerned you and you brought that up to Hayes? Do you remember that?
I don't know what.
You were discussing something to the effect of, you had a conversation with Chris and some of the knowledge and things that he knew, you just thought, well, I think that's kind of concerning and I think you need to know about that, Detective Hayes. Do you remember that at all?
Possibly I did. I don't know that I'm sitting here trying to think about that. I talked to Detective Hayes. I can't remember how extensively I talked with him about the conversations I'd had with Chris. I had gotten a lot of my information
from
Chris.
Right.
Because Chris contacted me to basically let me know what happened to his dad. I wasn't in Atlanta at that time. I had already moved out of Atlanta to Mobile, and he was kind of telling me what happened, and to a certain extent asking me, what do you think we should do here? And so I relayed to Detective Hayes everything that people had told me.
Sure. But you didn't bring up any of this conversation with Ms. Farris.
I did not. I did not bring that conversation up with anyone until, like I said,
About a month ago.
About a month ago. The first time I talked to Detective Hayes, to my recollection, was the last time I talked to Detective Hayes. And nobody in between that period of time until a month or so ago ever got in touch with me. So I guess to a certain degree it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. Maybe I should have called them, but I didn't.
Okay. But you can't remember, would it help to listen to the recording of your phone call?
Sure.
To refresh your memory?
Yeah. I mean, again, it was 6 years ago, and, you know, I don't doubt what you're saying. I don't remember. But I do remember what I was striving to do when I talked to Detective Hayes was to relay information to him that I thought would be helpful in the investigation.
We might need just a minute to get that together.
Well, we'll need to be outside the presence first and then go from there. So, y'all, anything else you want to ask me before we go down that road?
No.
All right, y'all step out.
At this time, I'm playing a recording that you made of the phone call that you made to Detective Hayes to help refresh your memory. And Judge, I mean, if you want, I don't have this timestamp and there's no transcript of this, so I'm going to move it kind of forward. It was towards the end of the interview, I believe. Play the whole thing.
After I had heard the news from two of our partners in our Atlanta office, and by the way, I practiced in Atlanta for the last 25 years. I just recently moved out of town to one of our other offices. So I'm somewhat familiar with the Farris property and very familiar with Gary's family, his children, so on and so forth. But anyway, Chris called me on Thursday afternoon and he said, I guess you've heard that my father has passed away. And I said, yeah, Chris, I heard, and I'm so sorry, so on and so forth. And we were just kind of chatting. He was like, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I want to do what my dad would want me to do, so on and so forth. And then during the course of that conversation, we're talking about his father's death. He made at least one comment that kind of made me think, well, why did he say that? And which was, my parents have been having problems, which I knew. Gary was a fairly personal person when it came to his personal life, so he didn't share a lot. But, when you spend so much time with somebody, you pick up on things and so on and so forth. So I thought that was an odd statement during the course of the conversation. When we were talking about his dad passing away, what he should do and how he should take care of things. That's how his dad would want him to do, so on and so forth. And that was kind of the gist of that conversation. So I hung up and then came into the office the next day. Chris called me back on Friday morning, and we started talking again. And it was at that point in time, we didn't know what had actually happened. And when I say we, I'm talking about the people at our law firm and myself and so on and so forth. We all assumed that Gary had passed away from a heart attack. We know that he had been having some medical issues, so on and so forth. So during the course of that conversation, Chris started telling me about what happened. And one of the things that struck me as unusual, and I'm going to tell you basically what he told me. He said that no one had seen Gary on July 4th, and that they all went to the lake and came back and still no one had seen him. And then the next day, which would have been the 5th, one of the grandchildren asked where Gary was, and that's when they started looking for him. And his car was there the whole time. His car keys were there the whole time. And Chris said that he and his brother Scott and Gary's wife Melody started looking around and eventually made their way to a point on the property where, and I don't know if it was a permanent burn pit or something else, but a place where they burned things. And Chris then said a couple of things that really made me, and this is why I'm calling you. First of all, he said, my mother went directly to the pit. I felt like she took us directly there. My brother Scott started stirring around in the pit and said, we need to call 911. Don't look in there. So that's what they did. And then, and this is what I found to be really unusual. Because, and look, I'm not a police officer, I'm not an investigator, etc., but, you know, I watch enough shows on TV to at least think, you know, I have some kind of idea what you guys go through in these investigations. Chris told me, he said, and they told me, he didn't say who they was, they told me that they found a rib bone that had a bullet in it or had been struck by a bullet, that it was a .38 caliber bullet, and that there's a .38 caliber weapon that was on the property that I guess belonged to them that was missing. And I thought about that, and I was thinking to myself, well, during the course of an investigation, I wouldn't think that the people doing the investigation are going to share that kind of information with someone. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just, you know, playing, you know, television detective or whatever. But I would think, that especially if you were one of the people who was on the property, that that's not something that they're going to share with you. So I found that to be odd that he told me that. Maybe I'm just dreaming things up. Maybe I'm conjuring things up. I don't know. But the more I thought about it, the more I was thinking, well, maybe I better tell somebody about that.
Yeah, and there were probably 15, 20 investigators there at any one time, and Scott was actually the one that pointed out to us, when I say us, detectives, that the gun was missing. Scott had discovered the gun a couple weeks ago. During the course of this, he went back to find it and couldn't. So that's how Chris would have known the gun was missing. And we have not identified the caliber of the bullet, so Chris might be assuming it's a .38 because the .38 is missing. So.
And again, detective, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody.
Right. And we do appreciate
I
appreciate the phone call, and I was just trying, that might explain that.
The other thing that Chris told me, and again, I'm hesitant to tell you this, but everything is that, he told me that he was 95.8% sure that his mother did this. And I said, well, Chris, they'll investigate. I'm sure they'll figure it out, hopefully sooner rather than later. So I don't know whether he's relayed that to you guys or not. That's what he told me. So those were the kind of conversations. And I had one more conversation with him after that, which was more along the lines of, he indicated to me, I guess, that they had all hired attorneys and so on and so forth. And I have not heard from him since. I'm assuming his attorney probably told him he doesn't need to be talking to anybody. The other thing that I was thinking about, and I wanted to relay to you guys, and hopefully this will be helpful. Again, not trying to do your job or not trying to play, detective. What Gary and I do, we're commercial transactional lawyers. We don't go in the courtroom. We're not people who we deal with primarily with banks, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, BBVA, Compass. We represent.
Does that refresh your memory?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
All right. Are we bringing back in?
Yes, Your Honor.
It is barely comfortable in here. Find y'all unlikely that you're going to interact outside your presence, and they're on the what's about to happen right here, and I'm fresh as recollection. But that's the process, and that's why we do it out trial. So that's the whole reason for that, and that's why it's critically important.
Transactional law.
Whatsoever. All right. With all that, Mr. Weaver, go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. So after listening to the recording, your memory has been refreshed, yes?
Yes.
All right. And you previously told the jury that you called because your primary purpose of the call, or the only purpose of the call, was to discuss, the nature of being a transactional lawyer. But there was a first part to that phone call, and could you tell the jury what that is?
Well,
Let's try to contain anybody to talk about.
Let's contain that too, and I asked you, what did you want to call and relay about Chris that you found to be concerning?
I don't know that I was necessarily calling about Chris, but what I was calling about was things that had been relayed to me from Chris that I found to be concerning under the circumstances based on where the matter was at the time.
Which would have been the 6th, I believe, Friday?
So my recollection is that, and actually thank you for playing that, because it reminded me that the 5th was a Thursday.
Correct. And yes, sir, we have a calendar right here to look at to refresh your memory.
Not Friday. I think I said Friday earlier, but it was actually, so Tuesday was the 3rd, Wednesday was the 4th, the 5th was the day that they found Gary's body.
Correct.
And so, and I'm sorry, what was your question again?
My question is what did you relay to Detective Hayes about the conversation you'd had with Chris?
All right, so I
that you
relayed
thought was
to Detective Hayes that I found concerning some of the things that had been relayed to me by Chris in that conversation. And my concern was based on not the fact that it was coming from Chris per se, but I was kind of concerned about, okay, this is early in the investigation, so where is this information coming from? It seems to me that, again, and you heard in the conversation, based on just common sense and somewhat limited knowledge about police investigations, I always thought that the investigators would hold things very close to the vest and not relay any information to anybody whatsoever, especially somebody like the deceased son who's on the property.
And that information was that he had relayed to you that a .38 was missing in the house, yes?
Yes.
And that a .38 special bullet was pulled from his father's.
I don't know if you said special. It was 38, yeah.
38 was pulled from his father.
Yes.
And Detective Hayes said back to you, we don't even know the type of bullet involved in this case.
In that conversation he did. But he also said that, that the information was...
Don't do anything that he said to you.
Well, but okay, I got you. I understand.
Unless prompted.
That's all, Your Honor.
All right. Anything else?
Just briefly, Judge. After speaking with Detective Hayes, you spoke with Chris, and then you relayed what Chris had communicated to you to Detective Hayes. Is that accurate?
Say that again?
You spoke with Chris, had called you, and then you relayed what you heard from Chris to Detective Hayes.
Correct.
And the information that Chris was telling you, you weren't sure anyone should know or would know.
Right.
Okay.
I was simply relaying to Detective Hayes what had been communicated to me. That's all I was doing.
And then after speaking with Detective Hayes further, did you have any other concerns regarding that conversation?
No. I mean, no. I was trying to be very factually based in what I communicated to Detective Hayes. I knew that it was early on in the investigation. I myself had just found out that this was a homicide investigation, and I was completely shocked by that because, again, we all believed that Gary had suffered some type of heart attack or a stroke or something like that, and had fallen over and burned up in a fire. And then we find out a day later that no, Gary was killed. He was shot. And so once I found that out, and after information had been relayed to me, I just thought it was important to tell the detective what I had, what people had told me.
Thank you.
Especially because it was just right there, the 5th.
All right,
So-
thank you. That's all I.
All right, so behind me is the next clip I'm going to play, and then I've got to take a break. It's school duty time. But what did we just hear? So I played that because that is some evidence that our friend Hannah B, I believe, began to form the basis that she believes Chris is involved. It's also why I now remember why I thought Chris had to been involved, at least to some level or degree, because on the 6th, he's talking to his father's business associate and has knowledge that it was a 38 caliber bullet, and that's what he's telling them. And again, this is all based off of Scott. Now, it may be that Scott's feeding all of this to the family, but that Scott's claiming that 38 caliber bullet, which he knows is he's telling the family this, but that little bullet, that little fragment, no one knew what that was at that moment. So how would any of them know what the bullet was that shot Garrett? There's no way to know that, except Scott is claiming to have seen a 38 caliber weapon, although he says he's not certain what caliber weapon it was because it was in a holster. The only person with 38 caliber bullets around them isn't Melody. It isn't Chris. It's Scott. And where does all this emanate from? Scott, through Chris, through everyone else. So this, again, is some more concerning things that are coming out that are indicating and pointing towards Scott. Now, the final thing that we're going to look at here and what I think is really just this jury should be back there. I know they're working through it, and to get to a not guilty is going to take some time because there are going to be people back there that some of these things flew over our heads. Some of them, you don't see it all the time, and hopefully they're all talking about it. But this right here, for everyone who says that Scott's alibi is accounted for, this guy right here shows there's a gap. So let's listen to his testimony. This is Scott's best friend, whom he was with over that 3rd to the 5th. And he was with him on and off, playing golf at the lake house. Listen to this testimony and listen to the timeline of events, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to re-listen to it because sometimes I miss things or I hear things or I think I heard something. I'm going to re-listen to it. And I believe it's going to tell me exactly what I remember listening and hearing a little bit ago. So here we go.
On Monday, July 2nd, I believe we played golf at the Manor that morning.
Who's we?
Me, Scott, and our friends Joe and Ryan.
Do you remember what time you teed up?
It would have been morning, probably 9-ish, I'd guess, on that day. I picked up Scott from the farm that morning, and we went to the Manor because it was relatively close to where he lived.
And what did you do after you played golf at the Manor?
I dropped him back off at the farm to get his truck, and then we went to a place called Rosati's for lunch.
All right. What did you do after Rosati's?
I left and went home.
And did you and Scott go your separate ways?
Yes.
Around what time was that?
I'd say that'd be, if I recall, sometime middle afternoon. If we had finished up with golf that day, it would have been around 12:31. And then we would have went and had probably a drink and some lunch at Rosati's, and then, probably 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Do you know if you and him communicated the rest of that Monday?
I do not recall. We may have, but it would have been a text or two at minimum, not a lot of conversation at that point.
Okay. So the next day would be Tuesday the 3rd. Did you see Scott that day?
I did.
What did you do?
Scott came up to the lake house, and we went out on the lake for the day.
Around what time did Scott come up to the lake house?
Probably early afternoon would usually been about the average time he would show up.
What did you do at the lake?
Took the boats out, probably did some surfing off the back of the wakeboard boat, probably took out the pontoon boat. I believe we went and watched fireworks from the water that night from one of the marinas up there. But that'd be about an average day on the lake.
Do you know, did Scott stay for dinner?
Yes, he did.
How late did he stay?
Scott left just before 11 p.m. on that night.
Was your house equipped with any security cameras?
Yes, I had a Nest security camera at my front door, or front porch driveway area.
And after finding out what happened to Gary, did you have the opportunity to pull that footage?
I did.
And what did you pull?
I pulled the footage of Scott leaving that evening just for the timestamp out of more curiosity.
State moves to admit I guess it's just Pierce 1.
No objection.
Okay, submit.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and publish this, Mr. Pierce. I'll go ahead and actually also move to admit Pierce 2, the screenshot of the timestamp.
No objection.
Pull this up first. This is Pierce 2 that I'm showing you. Is that the clip that you pulled down from
Yes.
Nest? And did you take that photo of the clip?
I took that photo with my cell phone, yes.
Okay. And so does that show the date and time of the clip itself?
Yes, it does.
Do you remember what day you pulled that down? And I say pulled that down, I'm inferring that you pulled that off of a cloud or some account that you have with Nest.
Correct. It's off my Nest account that I had at the time.
And you downloaded that?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember when?
I initially downloaded it back probably in 2018, but lost that thumb drive, and recently was able to gain access again to my Nest account and was able to re-pull the footage down just a couple days ago.
Was it already saved in your account?
Correct, yes.
From when you first pulled it
From
down?
when I first pulled it, yes, ma'am.
And did you pull it down after finding out what happened to Mr. Farris, Gary Farris?
I did.
I'm going to go ahead and publish Pierce 2. I'm sorry, Pierce 1, the video clip. And so is 10:55 the time that that clip saved?
Yes, ma'am.
So once he left that night, when was the next time you saw Scott?
The next morning at Hampton Golf Village, we had I believe a 7 a.m. or 7:15 a.m. tea time.
When you arrived at Hampton Golf Village, was Scott already there?
Yes.
What time did you arrive?
I believe Philip and I arrived around 6:45.
Had you heard from Scott before arriving at the golf course?
He did text me a little bit earlier that morning asking if we were awake and ready to go.
So you golfed at Hampton Golf Club on, that would be the day of the 4th?
Yes, ma'am.
How long did it take you to do that round?
That round was probably about 4.5 hours. Typical round.
18 holes?
18 holes, yes, ma'am.
So that puts you around lunchtime.
Correct.
What did you do next?
We went directly back to the lake house.
Who's we?
Me, Scott, and my brother-in-law, Philip.
So did Philip golf with you that day as well?
Yes, ma'am.
You went back up to the lake house. Did you guys stop anywhere?
No.
Once you got to the lake house, what did you do?
Probably went back down to the dock, went back out on the boat for a little bit. I left at some point in the afternoon for a few hours to go visit a friend at, I believe, a pool party in downtown Cumming, and then came back up to the lake house a little bit later.
Was Scott still there when
Yes,
you
ma'am.
arrived back? And did you guys go back to that pool party later that
did.
evening? Tell a jury about that.
After I got back up to the lake house, everybody had kind of started packing up to go home. My mom went home. My sister and my niece and my brother-in-law went home. And I was planning to go back to the pool party, and Scott came with me because it was on his way home. So
What time was that, do you think?
probably around 5:30, 6 o'clock, I'd say.
How long was that drive from your lake house to the pool party?
About half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour.
How long did you stay at the pool party?
I don't recall how long I stayed. I might have been there a little while.
How long was Scott there for?
Maybe an hour,
He
hour
did
and a
not
half.
stay as long as you
He did
did?
not stay as long as I did, no ma'am.
Did, when Scott, let me go back to the night of the 3rd. When Scott left the night of the 3rd, did he say why he was leaving?
He had gotten a phone call from his mom, and the horses had apparently gotten out, and he needed to go home and take care of that.
Did he tell you why he was leaving the pool party on the 4th?
Just no specific reason, just to go home.
Did you all, when was the next time you heard from him?
I heard from him the following day on, I believe, the 5th, Thursday the 5th.
Okay. Did you guys have plans that day?
We did.
What were your plans?
We were supposed to go meet a friend of ours, club fitter at PGA Superstore down in Roswell to get fitted for custom golf clubs.
Did you end up doing that?
I did, yes.
You did go?
I did go.
Okay. Did you hear from Scott?
All right, guys. So there it is. That's all we needed to hear of this testimony. The rest is about finding it. But the significant part you've just heard. Okay, so let's break down what we just heard. And then, like I said, I got school duty. I got to step away for a little bit. Then you're going to hear some background noise when I get back. And I'm back home. So, look, what did we just hear? We just heard that they play golf, which we know they did because the cell phone evidence that they provided us showed that they went there. We have just heard that he leaves and goes to a friend's house. So what did he do after golf? He went to a friend's house. That's what I believe. Now he's added in there, Scott came up to the lake house. Now maybe Scott did go to the lake house. Maybe they did go up to the lake house for a little while. But he leaves and he goes to a pool party. And what it sounds like is this friend here believing that Scott couldn't have done this and wouldn't have done this, and really is not thinking that he's thinking it had to have happened on the 3rd, right? He says, yes, Scott, what I think really occurred, or what we can inference here and put together, is Scott goes to golf, Melody goes to Lake Lanier, they go back to the lake house for a little bit, they split up, he goes to the pool party, Scott comes back later and meets him at the pool party for an hour. During the key time that this fire begins, as per that forensic anthropologist, Scott does not have an alibi. Scott is not accounted for. And let's just say for a minute that he wants to provide himself an alibi because under some theory here we say Gary's dead or the body's there, maybe laying on the burn pile, because there's nobody else on the property. Whatever happened has happened. But that burn pile hasn't been lit yet. It gets lit, as per the forensic anthropologist, somewhere around 1 to 2 o'clock, which falls in line with his testimony that he says they go back up to the lake house, they hang out for a little bit, he leaves, Scott's unaccounted for, goes back and starts that burn pile. And then as you heard, for about 2 to 3 hours, that thing's going to burn really strong. Then after that, the fire would feed off of the fat, which is what she was trying to say, and keep burning, which is why Scott Then, well, that's the next place we have to go, because I need to go back, and I don't have time to do it right now, but we'll do it in a little bit. I've got to go back and see what that cell phone analyst said and see what she said about Scott's phone location, because one of two things would happen in this instance. Either what he said happened and occurred, which is that, yeah, he leaves, Scott's up at the lake house, Scott leaves, and he would have left his phone up there for the purpose of knowing that he's about to go start this burn pile, which he wants everyone to believe Gary fell into. If that's which is what they would be trying to do, which is why, if Gary was already gone on the 3rd, and that's why there's no CPAP data, and that's legitimate, and that's very possible. I apologize, guys, for my dog. Hold on. Very apologetic. My dog likes to bark at anybody that walks across the front. Anyways, so but looking at the pieces and not having to speculate or say this is wrong. Gary passes away on the 3rd. And this is, or something happens to Gary on the 3rd, somewhere around the 3rd. Or maybe Gary's alive. I don't know. What we know is his cell phone's moving all around. We've always assumed he was dead. But we know the fire doesn't start. So Gary dies sometime between 9:32 and, well, we would say definitely he's not alive on the 4th. And whenever that burn pile starts, which is around 1 o'clock on the 4th. That's what we know. We don't know how he died in between. But what we know is whoever put him on the burn pile, it wasn't Melody, which means Melody was not involved in that, which means Melody did not do this alone at a very minimum. And the idea that Scott wasn't available, even if you say his phone's at the lake house, if at that point we're going to assume that one of two things is going on. If Scott's phone would have ended up back at that house, then we would assume that it wasn't intentional, or what I would say, we would assume maybe Gary wasn't dead yet, but we have to assume it's likely Gary's already dead. It's likely Scott's putting things in motion to do things to where Melody's at Lake Lanier, he's at the lake house, he knows his friend's got a pool party to go to. So Scott goes home, starts the fire, burns it up for a couple of hours. Fire dies down to a point to where it's just burning and it's not any danger to spread, which, as we know by Scott's own admission, if you want, who has experience with burn piles? Scott does. He tells the 911 operator this, right? He's seen bodies on burn piles. He knows how to do it. And then he heads back up, meets up with his friend. They go to the deal. And in Scott's mind, he has an alibi. Melody is the only one that would be on property during that time. And then, like I said, at the last minute, he decides it's either they're working together and he double crosses her, or there's a possibility she says she smelled Gary's cigarette smoke. If we give her credibility and say, could Gary have been alive? What we do know is his phone was walking around that property. And what we do know is that the only basis that Gary died is based on CPAP data that was not read by the proper code, by the proper software. So therefore, for a basis of credibility to establish time of death, I mean, everyone's talking about it like it was that night, but they're assuming that because Rusty says this. But now that we know that the burn pile, burning a body, couldn't have been burning at the time Rusty says that, that statement becomes irrelevant. It becomes not credible. It can't be used for anything. And if you don't believe me, go back and play this testimony back about Scott. And we have a big hole. And we've just walked you through everything. And I've played Scott's testimony. You've heard his testimony. You've seen him leave. Oh, and Cindy, my dog, I think my dog is about, I want to say he's about 13 pounds of ferociousness. He's actually a rescue animal. So for the first 2 years we had him, we did not see this side of him. And he has finally come out of his shell, and he really believes that he is the protector until somebody comes up, and then he's running to the bedroom and he goes under the bed. And then he lets dad and mom take care of things. So he's hilarious. Well, we know Wildflower. We've already established that there wasn't evidence of rolling. There wasn't evidence of any of that. Okay. So what we've established here is that the crime scene is not in a house. It's not around there wasn't evidence around the burn pile of blood, DNA, or anything that would indicate a shooting. Now there was a rainstorm that came through. Could that have potentially affected things? Possibly. Up around the burn pile, but not inside the house. Well, Cindy, that would have been the citronella. That's why the citronella was used. So whoever did this burn pile thought of everything. And I just really want to get into the minds here of really who in the why would we think that Melody, who didn't like Gary doing burn piles, who didn't have experience with burn piles, who by no testimony had any experience doing anything like that she is suddenly going to just have all this experience with how to cover up smells, how to get him to the burn pile, how to do all of this. It makes no sense. The only thing that makes sense is that either she had help or maybe she wasn't involved at all. But the bottom line is the only evidence that says she did this was Rusty's statement, which the forensic anthropologist destroys any chance that that statement was true. Kim, I don't think we had a complete thought there. So did any one of you listen? Is there something specific you wanted us to listen to? And Brian Bryson makes a great point. A 300-pound man shot twice would have so much more blood than what they found in the house. Where do you think he was shot? Again, my thought is he's either shot by the burn pile, although, again, there's an issue of a lack of physical evidence up there, too. Even though there was a slight rainstorm, that's going to cause it to saturate the ground. And they did forensic, although, again, the investigation was shoddy, but it would not have necessarily washed completely away. There could have been signs up there, but there was none. My thought is again, we go where they didn't go, the barn. That's the only explanation, because everywhere else it was checked thoroughly, and the barn was not checked. So we have to go there. And since we can't rule it out, it's like if there's 12 rooms in a house and you check all 11. Well, again, that is the inference that every prosecutor would stand up and tell you that's circumstantial evidence, right? Circumstance, I would tell you, but I mean, you can infer that that's probably where it happened. So what we can infer is it probably happened in the barn, what would mean that would possibly mean there was a confrontation there by someone. So, well, Beth, here's the problem. If you believe he was burning the burn pile, then you have to understand the part where the forensic anthropologist said that very burn pile that you would have thought he was starting and burning was started after she left the property. So she couldn't have been the one to shoot him. It didn't start on the 3rd. There's no way it could have. The forensic anthropologist, who's an expert on fire, said it was a one burn fire, meaning the body was burned in one pass, that fire could not have started any more than 1:09 p.m. on the 4th. She had already left. She was already going to Target. She was already heading up to Lake Lanier. She has receipts. They have video of her in Target. She is completely exonerated if that is when it happened. And if you believe he was shot at the burn pile, then that exonerates her, because she could not have done that. If the gunshot happened at the burn pile, it couldn't have happened. And Marmalade makes a great point. That's exactly correct. In fact, that very fact right there would have made is why Gary probably never wanted to divorce her, because he knows she was rightfully entitled, regardless of cheating or anything like that. Because of those facts, she was entitled under the laws of domestic laws would have absolutely been entitled to have. So says, does anyone think it had to be Ted that helped her with Gary's body, because Ted owed Melody $8,000, Gary's money? I don't think there were. I mean, obviously, if they looked into Ted and they saw that Ted was somewhere near the house, maybe we could think that was possible. But I don't think. I think at this point, there's no indication Ted was anywhere close to there, or that she called him. And Wildflower says, and the phone call to Rusty was on the 3rd of her saying Gary is on the burn pile. That's correct. It was on the 3rd at 2 a.m. 11 hours before it's even possible that burn pile was burning. So it is impossible, forensically impossible, based on the forensic anthropologist, based on the state's own witness, which is undisputed testimony that is before the jury. There's no way it could have happened. At the time that phone call is happening, that everyone is saying, oh my God, that's the proof of her guilt. It's impossible. And then you go and you say, well, when that burn pile was starting, who was available? The only person available without any witness as to their whereabouts is Scott, which we just proved here with this witness. The state proved it. And with that, I have to leave you guys. I will be back. Hopefully, I'm going to turn it to the verdict stream. You guys talk among yourselves, and I'll be back soon.